Yeah, yeah. I got to get lunch. I didn't pay for lunch. Yeah.
It's about 5 or 4.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it was quite fun. There's a few other work for like Brian does, and like they're sending me like funny like 90s videos. Like don't forget about me. I left this one for some of the videos. The drive report. I guess like so. Terry's involved in Bob's involved in every
Good morning. Good morning. Rebecca, it's time to put the phone away for the next 8.5 hours. It is 8 o'clock, right in 4 seconds, it's 8 o'clock, isn't it?
I did a really good job last time.
It being 8 o'clock, good morning everyone.
Good morning.
I'm going to go over attendance. Whoever's not here loses their attendance points. You can remind them that. I'm not going to remind them that.
Oh.
Christian Acero, no. Claudius, yes. Andre Crawford, no. Stephen Gouache, no. Victor Orguin, no. Chad Maxey, no. Luis, you're here, right? Yeah. Brandon Noodleman, no. Emmanuel, no. Christian Acero, you barely came in under the bell. Marianela, no. Marisela, no. Irene, no. Okay, welcome. If I didn't call you, I already marked you in, so I was just, I wanted to just sound off to people I didn't see. Okay, so welcome. Welcome. This is REE 5896, Real Estate Due Diligence, second session. Those of you who are in the program will have but just a few more weeks to go and we're done with it. Okay, so the first question I always ask is, where are 10-year treasuries today? Are you asking me or are you telling me? You know that for a fact. For a fact. It was at 2.01 when I left my office yesterday at 11. So I don't know what happened at the end of the day.
It was 2.00. It was 2.003. Then it fell 1.9. So
it's below 2.
Right.
No. We don't need to know. It's around 2. It's close enough. It's close enough. So the question is that good?
No.
No? Why not?
What is it, 1.8?
Is it bad? You can call it 2. Is it good or is it bad?
Well, it's pretty much where it's been for a while.
No, it's where it's been for 2 weeks, but it's not. I mean, it was at 2.3. I mean, stop to think. You say 30 basis points. Well, yeah, that's more than 10% change, in a couple-week period. That's dramatic for interest rates, right? Imagine if you're borrowing, like the U.S. government, $19 billion, right? Yeah. 30 basis points is like a huge either savings or increase depending on what you're doing. So it's neither good nor bad. I think it's indicative of certain things. We talked about this the other day. What did the Bank of Japan do yesterday?
Lowered their rates.
Lowered their rates to what?
Negative.
To a negative. So they basically charge you for safeguarding your money. So the central bank is charging banks to safeguard their money. So, those of you who took the capital markets class know that. What is Fisher's law? What is nominal rate of interest? 1 plus nominal equals what? 1 plus real times what? 1 plus inflation, right? So basically, the simple rule. Alexander, you don't remember this? I'm going to go back and I can still change your grade. Would you like me to do that?
No, I will not.
Okay. All right. Rebecca? You? Hello. Okay. So simply said, take out the ones, right? The simple rule is if real interest rates are 3 to say something, and there is a historical norm to say that, right? What's inflation today? I mean, people say inflation's nothing.
2.
2, 2.5. I don't know. I mean, other than the price of gas coming down, everything is going up more than 2, but let's say 2, right?
Well, 2 is the target, right?
No, I don't know about target. I don't know if it's target. I think, you know, probably, listen, I can tell you historical norms put this at 2.5 to 3, okay? So, you know, one should say, well, so nominal rate should be 5, right? But if nominal rates in a risk-free environment are like 2 over a long-term period, or negative in a short-term environment, in the worst of cases, not only are you not getting a real return, you're losing against, you know, you're losing purchasing power, right? So from a long-term perspective, I guess that I would say that the answer is that's probably not good in the long term, and it's probably indicative of some fundamental concerns that there are in the economy. Now, it's not the end of the world, but you know, it's kind of funny that the Fed, and we said this the other day, the Fed raised their benchmark discount rate, but the market said, we don't care what you do, kind of back. So anyway, I sent a couple of notes out, and I do want to spend a little bit of time just to sort of rehash what we did the other day. I sent a couple of notes out, independent of the email I sent to you. I did send a couple of notes out during the week, and some of it had some, what I think is valuable information. The first thing that I sent out was I sent an email that had multiple due diligence checklists, okay? If there's anything that I can give you from this class, are the tools that you could use for you to develop. I think, as I said, and I want to repeat, none of those that I sent were either true, correct, the ideal, the appropriate one. They just were examples of one that I went over in class the other day. One happened to be one that a friend of mine uses, who is an acquisitions guy. He's actually spoken in this class before. I didn't ask him to come this time. He's about to have a second kid. He's kind of, you know, in a mess, so I didn't ask him to come. But I'm going to go over some of his notes from his presentation in a second. Another one was one I just pulled off the shelf from a, you know, national firm that does, you know, site inspection work. One came from Irene that she's used in the hospitality sector. There's a flow chart that Irene was kind enough to send that they used in their sort of fund environment. And you can apply that to a fund, you can apply it to a development business, you can apply it to your own, you know. Identify something, does it meet initial criteria, is it worth investigating, go through diligence, put a book together, you know, present, does it make sense, do we move forward, etc. Okay, and so, you know, at the end of the day, what is important is, you know, not to cut and paste it, not to convert the PDFs that I sent you to a Word document, but to try to understand what the tools that I gave you are, so that when you are faced with a situation of acquiring an asset or a business, you can then create your own list that says, hey, these are the steps that I need to create. When I set up the diligence practice at Ernst & Young many years ago, there were 2 things that we would do at the beginning of an engagement. One, we would put together a list of steps and procedures that we wanted to accomplish. So we had our work program. Independent of that, and what I've not given you is you always give someone a document request list. Now, in a real estate environment, you know, especially in an institutional real estate environment, people know what they're doing, people will set up a data room already, people will most likely already have all the information that you're looking for readily available for you. But one of the things that you always need to be prepared to do is in conjunction with the steps and the procedures that you want to carry out, you need to have a list of documents that you need in order to do that, okay? And a lot of times, that requires additional work from a seller. It may require, you know, pulling out old files. It may, you know, require pulling things from storage. It may mean making legal requests. It may, you know, hey, I need estoppel letters. We'll talk about those. I need estoppel letters. There's a lead time involved. And so, stop to think. In order to carry out the work, there's information that's needed. In most cases in real estate, most of that will be readily available, but not necessarily. Okay, so make sure that, here's what I'm going to do, that you make a document request list for all of your assignments. The other thing that I sent was a legal brief from and this one I pulled down. It's from a large regional law firm in the Midwest, and it's a partner that just does real estate work. And I thought it was a nice summary. It's a 9-page document. And again, it's kind of interesting, this class, I think this is the last time this class is going to be taught. Dr. Fortigue's kind of vamping the program, which is good. It's healthy to make changes every now and then, although I think some of the things we go over in this class are valuable. But anyway, the class used to be taught by someone who's an attorney. I'm a CPA. I got a different training, I have different perspective, a different optic in the way I look at things. One of the former students that I had shared with me the material that the previous instructor shared with his students, and I have it. I'll go over it with you the last class. But he basically went from a legal brief that was 40, 50, 60 pages, and it was diligence strictly from a legal perspective. So his whole focus was title and survey and zoning and environmental, and a lot of times, mine, you're going to get market analysis, for leasing, for sales comps. So depending on if you get a construction guy that's doing a diligence, he's going to be a lot more concerned with property conditions, roofing, So everyone that looks at an asset is going to have a different optic, and at the end of the day, none of them are right on their own. You need to pull all of those different disciplines and all those different concepts and all those different ideas and needs into one. Okay, so I've shared them with you so that you develop your own. You develop your own methodology. You develop your own. I can't use my computer, so I'm going to have to do this from here. So as I mentioned, one of the forms, the second, I think version number 2 that I sent to you that's had a date that said October 23rd, 2014, was a friend of mine that's presented in this class before. He basically, in his mind, and I just want to share somebody else's perspective, again, very top level. Just the more we reinforce the concepts, the more that I think you're going to learn. He basically broke his diligence into 4 different areas, okay, in his mind. These are my notes from when he made his presentation, okay? And then the last one is market, okay? So we kind of did this one this last week and this week, and basically market basically comes down to 2 different things. What did we look at last week? Market, what were we concerned with last week? In class project? Yeah, so we're looking for lease rates. What's the market, right? What's the revenue potential, right? Because ultimately, revenue is the number that all the expenses are subtracted from. If you don't have revenue, you don't have a business. Never forget that, right? You can model anything you want, but if you don't sell something, you don't have a business, okay? So when we try to understand the markets, there's 2 market understandings that we need to have. One is, what's the current revenue potential? So what are competitive assets leasing for? What is the market? What does the market bear, right? So last week we kind of did a very top level, down to a very micro look, right? We said, what's the national market look like? What's the state market look like? What's the general metro look like? What does this sub-market look like? And then what I said you needed to do beyond that was, what does the competitive property set look like, right? So, know what I said? So, yeah, national's less important when you're doing diligence. State is less important. The metro is important. The sub-market is very important. But the actual buildings that compete against the one you're acquiring, or the ones that are going to compete against the one you're developing, those are the most important ones, okay? So what we're going to focus on today is sales comps, right? So, basically cost. So here what we're trying to do is what? Validate the purchase price that we think we can pay or should pay for an asset. And again, you could have every building is unique, so I can't just say widget A should cost this, right? And so when we take a look at sales, and we'll spend a little bit more time later on, we look at sales comps, we could look at cost per unit, per door, per square foot, or, so we can look at value in an absolute term, or we can look at value from a relative term. And in the real estate industry, the relative valuation is what? Cap rates, maybe, right? So in stocks, the relative valuation is what? PE ratios. Class, wake up. Saturday, January 30th. 54 degrees outside. It's nice and warm and toasty in here. Okay, so in stocks, in other financial assets, we talk about price-earnings ratio, right? That's the relative valuation. How does this particular asset compare to that asset? In real estate, how do we compare assets that are not identical? We talk about cap rates, right? So how do we value that cash flow? Cap rate is essentially the inverse of price earnings. Okay, so it's the same thing, just looked at upside down. But ultimately, it's a valuation, and we can do the same thing, and we'll do that later today. So on a national level, what do assets like this trade for, right? On a state level, but much more importantly, in our metro, in our sub-market, competing buildings. Because ultimately, if you pay $400 a square foot for a building, and your neighbor next door is paying $300, that puts you at a competitive disadvantage, right? Because hopefully your return expectation is not radically different than anyone else's, and your cost of capital shouldn't be radically different than anyone else's. Okay, so when we look at markets, two different things that are important. What's the revenue potential today, and what's the sort of cost? Now, we'll look at appraisals later on in the term, because how you validate what you're willing to pay is not just looking at comps, right? We look at things like replacement costs that are important. So, yes, Quincy?
What's that abbreviation next to sales?
Cost.
No, it's cost. It's not an abbreviation. It's just my bad handwriting.
Oh, okay.
Cost.
Oh, I don't know.
Okay. I get your telescope back there. So that's, that's how he kind of broke it out in his mind, and that's kind of the way his checklist goes. He broke out legal in a variety of different ways, right? So the first thing is the purchase sale agreement. Yes, Edeni?
One question.
Yes.
We're going to focus today on sales and cost.
Sales comps, yes.
Okay. I always have an argument with people about sales and cost of an asset, or how much it could cost. Because a lot of people that come to me says, well, but it's as if. And they try to sell something as if, or with the second year revenue,
Yep.
but not with what happened before, or
Yep.
the real cost.
Okay,
Can I talk about that as well?
Yeah, well, we're not going to do that in class later, but we can talk about it now, because I think that's important, okay? There's two things. When you're talking about what-if scenarios, that's probably more of a discounted rate, right, or a capitalization approach to value, right? If we make all of these capital improvements, if we in hotels change the flag, or we change the market, or we change the leasing agent, or if we redo the common areas, right? If you buy this building and you invest $2 million in common areas, you will get this revenue stream, which is different than what's in place today. So the problem with that is the following. The problem with that is that the seller is going to want to be paid for that, because they're saying, hey, you have the potential for this revenue, but as a buyer, you should say, yeah, but I'm the one that's investing the money to do that, and it's post money to you, so I pay you X, and then I have to pay Y in order to get that. The simple answer is that you should pay for the income stream that you are acquiring. And as an astute buyer, as a master in real estate development or in real estate, you're going to bring to bear a series of valuable bits of knowledge that you've gained here in this class, the assets to juice up this revenue stream, right? And you shouldn't pay someone for it. Now, Irene, the answer is you're going to pay whatever the market bears. And I keep going back to in equilibrium, we go through the dialogue that we had in the capital markets class, that real estate is a financial asset, and we should pay for a financial asset nothing more and nothing less than the net present value of its future cash flows, right? and we're gonna assume that everyone's cost of capital is gonna be relatively proximate. We're gonna assume that everybody's estimate of revenues is gonna be relatively proximate. We're gonna assume that everyone's operating costs going forward are gonna be relatively proximate. And what I can tell you, again, my personal experience, I've been in situations where we've bid on buildings and, there have been as many as 20 guys, and, there's always some crazy guy that's really, thinks he's gonna steal the asset. Some guy comes up with a number that they can't underwrite and can't, finance. But most people are within a relatively tight band. And, in situations like today, where there's probably more dollars chasing fewer deals, there's probably going to be unrealistic expectations at where prices are going to clear, which may not really correspond to that equilibrium formula we just talked about. So, yeah, the problem that I think the people that I know that deal in acquisitions, their concern is always that if you really estimate this properly, and you really value this according to what peers are doing, you're never going to buy anything. You're always going to have to be a little bit more optimistic than what, So, an accountant can't be an acquisitions guy because he'll never buy anything. It's a reality, An accountant can never be a developer because he's going to put too many contingencies. He's going to have too much expectation of, premium for the development process. So, there's no answer yet, but it's a good thought. It's something to discuss. It's something to be aware of.
My point is that as a potential developers, I see too many potential developers or small developers that come from funding, and they come with such a big expectation and think that they heard that they can sell something with the potential because the appraisal says as if not only the other ways that you appraise, that they never get funded, so they get frustrated, they don't develop anything, and you see small companies and people with a lot of potential that don't get funded because of that particular issue about sales cost and expectation.
I don't remember exactly how I used to say it, but one of my old bosses used to say something like, anybody with a couple bucks and a friend who's a banker can be a developer. I think in a serious realm, when you take a look at national development firms, you look at firms like Hines, for example, Tishman. There is a certain rigor, there's a certain structure, which you're not going to see people developing to unrealistic expectations. Which is not to say that those firms have not had issues over time in missing market cycles or totally, misunderstanding a market. We talked the other day, it's one of the issues I'll bring later on, we talked the other day about Houston. How most office markets in this country look like they still have a fair ways to run, and Houston was sort of past 12 o'clock already, right, in the clock. And, in addition to overbuilding, significantly, more people bet on what was going to happen. What's been triggering a lot of this economic turmoil lately?
China.
Energy, right? And what's the energy capital of this country? Houston. And so, in addition to people overbuilding, did you say China? Yeah, China, it's true, that's true, yes. But it's, yes. Give her a star. We'll keep stars for you today.
Yes.
Does that make you happy, Rebecca?
Yeah.
Okay.
I got a smiley face at work yesterday.
Good.
They did bathroom elevations.
So they're basically working the same way that I am here, trying to motivate you, okay? But so what happened? The developers. We talk about the long lead time that's involved in the development process, right? So in this class, it's easier to focus on diligence from the perspective of existing cash flow, but obviously it's something that we need to take a look at from a development perspective as well. So, probably 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when people started planning for buildings in Houston, they were saying, wow, look at all the money all these MLPs and all these energy companies are raising, and look at all the debt that they're putting out there. Hey, and all these companies are growing, there was huge demand for space. And so, people went to the planning boards, they got their architects, they, started getting off the ground, and what happened? Energy goes south, and all these projects not only have come on, they're gonna come on, and they're just gonna clobber the market, And so, to your point, things can go bad for people that are intelligent. The less sophisticated developers. So the guy that comes from Venezuela with $3 million and thinks he can, you know, one of the students in the program called me the other day and says, yeah, I'm in a development with a friend of mine who came from Venezuela, and we're doing 17 townhouses, I don't know where. That's where you got to be careful, because with, you know, 3, 4, 5 million bucks, you got enough money to go to the bank. And a lot of people don't understand the market. They don't understand costs. They don't understand the time constraints in getting things permitted. They don't understand that existing conditions can affect the development timeline. People may be talking to residential brokers that are telling them, oh, don't worry, we can sell everything and it's going to go up 30% every year, and then we'll, you know, we'll get a Colombian guy and he'll buy it and he'll sell it to a Russian guy, you know, he'll sell it to a Ukrainian guy, and then a Chinese guy is going to come in and buy it, okay? And everybody's going to make 30% along the way. And in a community, in a small business environment like South Florida, you see a lot of that. You know, but, you know, I just say, you know, beware. That's why it's good you're in these programs and you're not just sort of, you know, going out and, you know, developing crazy. Well, while we're on that, I wanted to share this. This is just, it's free advice, so you do whatever you want with it. But, so a student in the program, I haven't seen him in a while, called me out of the blue this week. And so he told me what he was doing. But the reason he called me was because he said, look, I have a friend who has a lot of money in Venezuela, and he went and bought this huge asset in Puerto Rico. Bought this huge industrial asset. I'm thinking, you already messed up. I mean, you know, it's like, no, I bought this 1 million square foot former manufacturing facility. You know, I'm thinking, you know, pharmaceutical. Yeah, it was pharmaceutical, and it's empty. Because it's just a long story, but in Puerto Rico there was a tax benefit to manufacturing. I think it was Section 959, and if you didn't repatriate dollars, they were tax exempt from U.S. income taxes. So as pharmaceuticals, you could manufacture in the U.S., which is important. You could shield taxes, and then the local benefit to the island was that the banks were flush with cash, and so they could provide low-cost credit to, you know, the other businesses in the island. It was kind of a win-win, but that exemption has been phased out over the last, you know, 15 years. So the pharmaceutical industry has essentially left Puerto Rico. Anyway, so the request was, look, I need a broker, an industrial broker in Puerto Rico. Why would you ask me now?
You love brokers, right?
I love brokers.
Yeah.
No, but I don't know why he asked me, but I did spend about 2 years trying to do something in Puerto Rico, you know, with my last company. And I did several trips down there. You know, we met with the governor, we met with Pridco. So I had a fair bit of experience just, you know, by you know, coincidence. And so I said, listen, I don't remember the guy's name, but there was one industrial broker in Puerto Rico. I mean, it's like the only serious guy, and I'll find him and I'll get it to you. And so he said, oh, that'd be great, because I'm going to call him up and ask him for a cut of the commission. Son of a bitch. It's like, okay, you know, you got to be careful. So I found the guy. In fact, I found the guy's son, because the guy is already old and his son had taken over the business. So I sent it to him, but my advice was, be careful what you ask for, because number one, in my personal experience, it's very common in residential. Oh, I get a referral fee. I'm gonna, you know, I want to bring you all my friends from Brazil, and I get half of your commission or whatever. But in commercial realms, it's not kosher. It's not appropriate. And my advice was, cultivate long-term relationships. Put your friend in touch with a broker. Take care of them. Make sure they do business together well. And over time, they'll bring opportunities to you. As opposed to, they're not going to give you anything. I'm talking about, this guy's never going to find a tenant there, okay? That's the number one, okay? There's never going to be any money made. But assuming that there was, you know, put people together, put good people together, and hopefully, you know, one day they'll open up, as opposed to, you know, being a sore, you know, thumb in a relationship, and working for peanuts, you know, a couple bucks. So thankfully, wrote back, you know, Profe, thank you very much. I think you're right. You know, I'm just going to put these people together. I don't know if you will or not, but anyway, just share that advice. Always have a long-term view. you know, in this business, it's always, you know, it's always interesting, or I think falsely interesting, to try to make a quick hit. Hey, what can I get out of this, you know? Try to take a look at long-term relationships and long-term friendships, and I think in the long run, those will help you more than a quick hit, okay? So, in the legal realm, you know, my friend looked at the legal environment. So he looked first at the purchase-sale agreement. Why? And as I said, that typically gets negotiated up front, right? Most sellers are going to tell you or give you a form of what it is that they're willing to sign. And you're going to have to, you know, either accept it or not, or mark it up or comment. And ultimately, you know, it talks to, more than anything else, what reps. We'll go over a contract in one of the next sessions, but what representations or warranties are you willing to live by or accept from a seller? And then, you know, sort of more routinely, what are the terms? When do we close? When do we go hard? You know, when do we exchange money? What does the title look like? Who pays for it? Who provides a survey, right? What can I expect in the way of estoppel letters? You know, blah, 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 right? So ultimately, you got to start here, okay? When we talk about that, title and survey, okay? So, you know, you gotta order a survey. You gotta take a look at it. I'm not, you know, that's not my forte, right? But, you know, bring an attorney in, take a look at all the exceptions, take a look at all the, you know, easements that have been granted, conditions, title. What does it say? You know, what notes? What does your attorney tell you? Can you live with it? What does your title company tell you? What are they looking to, you know, have remedied or fixed? Can they write a policy on it? So at the end of the day, if you can get it backstopped by a legitimate company, you know, it's probably worth buying, even if you don't totally understand or feel comfortable with it. But if there's a problem with title, you're not going to be able to underwrite a policy on it, okay? The more that we get involved, especially in development or redevelopment, then the question becomes, what does zoning look like, right? So in an existing building, it is probably more a concern of, is the current use what it's entitled for? So am I going to buy something and somewhat, you know, run the risk, somewhere down the line, run the risk that some municipal guy is going to come and shut me down or shut down one of my tenants, right? So you could say, well, does that really happen? Well, you could buy an industrial park and maybe there's a dry cleaning, you know, business in there. And maybe, you know, they're not allowed to do that. Or maybe there's a printing business there and they've got ovens to dry the ink and there's air emissions and they don't have the proper EPA permits, okay? You know, so there's a series of things you need to be concerned about, but more so if you are taking a greenfield or a brownfield or a redevelopment project, you know, in hand. So Wednesday I met with 3 former students who are sort of getting off the ground, trying to get a development business going. And one of them has access at a couple of sites up the road, one up in DeLand and another one in Orlando. And, you know, the questions are, what are the sites? You know, one of them is near a university. It potentially has student housing possibility, right? But, you know, the question is, what kind of density can you build on it, right? You know, what kind of parking requirements you have? What are the neighbors going to do? So, you know, that's, and then the other one was an empty office building in a sort of, you know, mixed racial, lower socioeconomic environment. What can you do there, right? Can you build residential? It's an office building right now, it's empty. Can you build residential? What's the density, right? What are the neighbors going to do? And then you get into, you know, other issues, but at least what am I going to be allowed to build, or what do I think I can ask for permissions from, right? And what are the time frames involved in that? We talked about, you know, his point, the other one was easements in particular, right? So what rights do you have in other properties, or what rights have you given up in your property, right? So there's easements, there's cross, what are they called, CCRs? when you're in communities, yeah. Agreements that exist between either neighboring or adjoining property owners which allow or govern the conditions under which you can go. I'll give you a very typical or common, example. Retail development. They'll typically sell the out parcels to banks, restaurants, right? So the question is who has right to come in and go out? Who has rights to park where? And, that could be an issue of, all of a sudden a bank may take a tremendous amount of parking, or a restaurant may take a tremendous amount of parking during certain peak hours of the day. How's that going to impact, the other tenants, right? And what governs that? I mentioned to you last week the office building that I had looked at in Gateway in St. Pete. The problem they had was that they had granted a hotel next door. So the developer had built, it was a master developer, built a bunch of office buildings, but he had some service facilities. So there was a retail area and there was a hotel. And when they sold the development rights to the hotel, they granted the hotel developer the right to overflow parking on the office building. So what happened? The hotel became popular for lunches, banquets, and all of a sudden in the middle of the day, 500 cars would show up and suck up all the parking spaces in the office building. What happened with the tenants in the office building? They got pissed. They got pissed. But there was a right that had been given. Okay, Alexander, you had a...
Yeah, the similar issue happened with parking in Orlando development, where the developer himself promised parking to an existing restaurant, and then he went ahead and sold that same parking to a new tenant coming in, and that tenant actually sued the developer and caused huge issues for the development, and making a pretty big deal over parking. So it's pretty common to see that parking be a big issue.
I used to run an asset that had about 15, 20 acres of excess land, and it was in a very nice sort of corner. So we sort of owned all this. And we had a big industrial development out back this way. We had all this extra acreage, and so, we started very softly marketing this stuff. And so somebody came to us and said, hey, we want to buy that corner, we want to put a gas station. Unfortunately, it was one of my coworkers, so it caused quite a problem. But ultimately, he came in and said, hey, look, we want to buy, I think it was like 3/4 of an acre. So they were going to put, gas station, dry cleaner, ice cream, McDonald's, car wash, truck wash, all kinds of stuff. And, I got our architect, and then he wanted all sorts of cross easements. So he wanted to come in from anywhere onto the property, and he wanted to be able to park anywhere. The reality is when we took it to our architects, that guy probably needed to buy about 1.5 acres in order to accommodate all the uses. And what he was trying to do was essentially accommodate his use by pushing off, look, can I park, all the entrances. And so, we wound up saying, listen, you want to do all that stuff? Buy double the land. Oh, it doesn't make sense. Okay, well, sorry. And so, but listen, and I can understand. So I'm looking at it from the seller's perspective. From a buyer's perspective, that's something you're going to push for. What can I do, right? Do I need to buy enough land to really park 5 per thousand if I only need that for 30 minutes during the day? Can I find the adjoining property owner, willing, is he going to entice me to sell the land, by giving me that right? Because maybe at lunchtime he doesn't have. In a retail setting, that may not be an issue. Because at 12 o'clock in the day when McDonald's fills up, that's not a big deal. So, anyway, so that's the way he took a look at, he broke his physical essentially into a couple of different areas, and one was very broadly structural, right? So, when you look at structural, right? So, I mean, you actually take a look at the structure, but, glazing, roofing, mechanical systems, right? So, anything that was sort of above the ground, and again, in his particular realm, that all got subbed out. right? That's a company that doesn't really have the in-house competence. They go find the right consultants, and they rely on what the consultants tell them. And then he kind of said, hey, and then I look under the ground, and he's going to call that environmental. As I mentioned, environmental may actually be above the ground, but that's only in certain industrial cases, right, where you're putting emissions out. But so his whole thing was, okay, what does my phase one tell me? And if my phase one tells me something, and we'll go into detail about phase one. Phase one tells me something, do I need to do a phase two? And what are the recommendations of the phase two, right? Do I need to remediate? What's the process involved in a remediation? Or can I look the other way? Or do I walk away because there's no remedy here? Okay? So that was his whole thing, was what's above the ground and what's below the ground, right? And again, this is a whole series of different.
You could have environmental above ground too, like
You-
mold and mildew and all of that.
You could have that. You could have that, and I'm telling you, air emissions is is another sort of common in industrial areas. So, but the big concern here is what if people put into the ground on your property, or what if people put into the ground in adjoining properties? Are there underground tanks? Was there a gas station here? Was there a gas station next door? Was there a dry cleaner here? Was there a printing company here, or they would just dump? I was in graphic arts for a long time, and I worked for a guy that taught me everything not to do. Everything not to do. So one common thing he would do is, it was very costly to send all the chemical products out, right? So at night he'd think I didn't know, but he'd tell the guys just dump it out the back, and where the rail spur was, just dump it out, right? So eventually somebody's going to come one day and sample that thing, and one day Durham did come and find that. The other one he did before I worked there, I found out about that one. He would just have somebody take all the drums of the old ink and the old solvents and just dump it in the Everglades. And he got caught with that one because one of them blew up once, caused a fire. Metro Dade Fire went out there and they saw, Graphic Productions Company all over all the drums. So just, or use a different drum or paint it or something. I mean, so. And then his whole economic thing was kind of sort of top and bottom as well. Top of the line, revenues, right? So what impacts that? For example, leases, right? So that's really the single biggest, revenue stream in most of our diligence projects, right? But there could be ancillary revenue sources like, parking or ground leases that we have. Signage that we sell, aerial rights, something like that. And then, expenses. What are my operating expenses? What are they? What are they historically? What have they been? And what can I accomplish? And what is this sale or transaction going to impact? So when I buy the building, what is that going to do to property taxes? When I buy the building, am I going to be able to bring a lower cost for insurance? Or is insurance going to cost me more, right? Am I going to be able to lower any of the operating expenses through efficiencies that I bring? Or is it going to cost more because I want to, make it a little bit better? Emmanuel, you had a question.
Yeah, on the environmental side, we're looking at a property right now, and I think it was previously used as a gas station, but the city has a sanction that they need to clear
The tanks?
Now, is EPA going to pitch in, for some money to it, or?
Listen, at every site, I'm not an expert in this, okay? So there are massive sites that have what are called EPA or super cleanup fund dollars available for their cleanup. I would venture to guess that most corner gas stations are not going to qualify for that. So if you're in the Love Canal outside of Buffalo, New York, you may get some dollars, but the reality is in a local area, you're not likely going to get dollars. Now, you've got to take a look and see whether you really need to remove the tanks or not. And we've had situations where we've just let the tanks, and lenders have gotten comfortable with it, and they're there. There's no known, seepage, there's no contamination, there's just a tank. And the problem is, the tank in and of itself isn't the problem. The tank is indicative of the fact that there was a use there that may have created contamination. So, yeah, I can tell you the 1031 we did at Flagler, we bought 200 and something CVS stores. We bought the triple net leases, right? And a bunch of those sites had underground tanks. Where do CVS's get put? On corners. What used to be on corners? Gas stations. And it was an issue of getting used to it. And the lender got comfortable with it. And we got comfortable with it. Well, you know what? They've been there. They're undisturbed. Why mess with it?
You're only a problem when they're leaking.
When they're leaking, or when something leaked before, and again, it's maybe it didn't leak, but the fact that there was a gas station, there may have been, people dumping oil, old oil, change oil, they just throw it out the back or whatever, right? So, or just the spills, the everyday spills from people pumping gas. So.
And how would you add a cost value to them, like a percentage, or how would you go as far as?
Listen, I think when you get here, you've got binary decisions, okay? You go or you don't go. So, number one, you got to make that call, right? If you go, then what's the cost associated with it? Then you set aside a reserve. But the first one is do I go? Do I have the time available? And can I quantify the cost? And do I have the consent or the support or the buy-in of the regulatory authority, okay? And depending on the level of contamination and the type and the site, you may have just a local organism. In Dade County, it's DERM. I don't know what it's called in Broward, but in Dade, it's a Dade Environmental Resource Management, Then you've got state level, right? The Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or you've got EPA. And depending on what your use is and the level of contamination, you may have one, because EPA sort of delegates its rolls down to the states and the states down to the municipal governments, okay? You may have 1, 2, or 3 layers of review. But ultimately, so let's take a look at your site. There was a tank. You've talked to local guys and they've told you, they've given you certainty that if you remove the tank and you remediate the groundwater, you're going to be okay. Well, you go to an environmental engineering firm and figure out what it's going to cost to remove and what it's going to cost to install, the water, treatment, to give you an estimate of the time involved with that, and you project the dollars and include it in your underwriting and figure out if it makes sense. Now, you may get to a point where you say, hey, we know there's a tank, we know there's soil contamination, the environmental firm's telling you, listen, we're going to have to do an additional phase 2, we're going to have to do X number, now we've got to sample the whole property, it looks like it's leached, it looks like it's leached to an adjoining property, we're going to have soil removal, we can't remediate the groundwater, and we need 6 months to come up with an estimate. Or they come up and say, listen, you got to remove so many cubic yards of dirt, that's going to cost you $750,000 and the site only costs $500,000, just to say something. And you kind of go, okay, next, right? Let me go to the next corner, So, yeah, Alexander.
Let's say if there's a leak into a property next door, during your due diligence, do you have to notify that other property owner that you found a leak into their property, or does the owner of the property take care of that? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to properly answer that. What I would say is I don't.
So are you asking an ethical question?
Yeah,
are you required by law to notify?
I don't believe that you have a legal obligation to notify an adjoining property owner that you've come up or you've identified that there is some potential contamination on their site. Now, I'm not sure you have a moral obligation either, okay? Now, if you buy the site and you're going to have to remediate it, maybe, because at some point, listen, if you buy the site and you have to remediate it, at some point you're going to have to get a local governmental agency involved.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to have to buy off on the plan. They're going to identify that. It's going to become public record. And there, I don't know what their legal obligation is vis-a-vis notifying the adjacent owners, okay? So,
I went through that. I worked for the school district for a while, and there are several gas stations located next to, I think we have about 500 properties across Dade County. And we always got contacted if there's a contaminated site next to us, they have to come on our site to
Right.
sample.
right.
And then, you know, our legal department would get into a fight with the adjacent
Property owner. Right. So, you know, there's a situation where somebody really wanted to buy, they wanted to see the extent of the contamination, so they had no choice but to sort of spill the beans, right? You know, and especially it being a governmental entity as well, so, need any? I mean, Maricela?
They're required to disclose. If you find contamination on your property.
They who?
The owner of the property who find, and the environmental firm making doing the study, there are the regulations that they are required to disclose to the appropriate governmental.
To a governmental agency, but not necessarily to an adjoining property owner.
Well, it's always possible.
Well, but then it becomes public record, exactly.
Then who's looking at the public records?
Well, whenever somebody comes, when somebody, yeah, and when somebody comes to buy next door and they do a phase
But the guy that
one,
owns next door, that's not necessarily selling, that's just hanging out.
that, he may not know, he may not find out. But listen, if you buy a site next to a gas station, you're always gonna be on edge, as, you know, especially when you buy what works better, and you're definitely gonna sample on the edge of your property, right? Because at the end of the day, you're not gonna sample on the other side or an acre away, right, 1,000 feet away. You're gonna go to the edge of the property line and take, you know, soil borings and do groundwater samples there.
No.
But aren't you doing this due diligence before you actually purchase the property?
That's correct.
Right.
But you may buy in spite of the fact that you know this.
Right, but I'm saying to his question, he's saying, do you have a duty to notify the next door?
Right.
Neighbor, tenant, whatever it is? You don't even actually own the property at that point.
Yet, right, that's correct. Now, Maricela's saying that the
understand what you're
environmental
saying.
engineering firms have an obligation to disclose that, and that's outside my realm. That
And
may be
would
the case.
And that would be the
current owner's
the agency that.
The government entity.
And, or the firm, the environmental firm that came and did the study.
Right.
They would have that.
Obligation to notify. That's what I'm being told. It may be the case. We have an expert here.
Yeah, but how does that work? So fine, I bought it, I know, I don't have to disclose, but now I bought it, and now potentially I have a neighbor who's saying, hey, your groundwater, I don't care that it happened 10 years ago, you own it, it's because of your property, I'm gonna sue you because your property
Yeah, and
leached into mine and made mine less valuable.
well, and remember, environmental issues sort of go up the chain of title as well. So it's not only you, it's all the other people that were on title
But you're on
along
the
the
chain,
way.
so now you're kind of.
You're on the,
struggling
and you're
with
the guy there, so
Yeah.
you're potentially gonna have to, you know, pick that up. And that's why you may not have to tell the guy,
Yeah.
but you're gonna have to deal with it.
I was asking
So,
more.
so if you really want to buy it, you better find out the extent of it and understand what it's gonna cost you to deal with it.
I was asking more being the person that owns the property next door, that's where I was thinking of, basically, if I own a property next to a gas station, are they required by law to notify me of a leak or contamination, or if someone was to stumble upon a contamination by law, do they have to notify me as the property owner next door? That's where I was trying to figure out, just more of not of being ethical with it, just basically, you know, if there's a situation going on next door to your property, or do you need to be notified, or can you be notified of a situation, just being property owner?
And I think the point that Maricela says is it becomes all public record when the adjoining property owner deals with it. I seem to recall somewhere along the way finding, you know, coming to grips with it, and regulation may have changed since I left is, if in fact, if even you become aware of something, do you need to notify, or can you play possum and wait for the environmental agency to come in? And at one time, you didn't have to notify. You, as a potential owner, and then an acquirer, that in fact there were issues. There was a contingency there, but you didn't need to disclose it. but you were aware that you might have to deal with it. Maricela's telling me that you now need to disclose it. That may very well be the case. It sounds from a social or civic perspective that that's where the law would take this.
It depends on what type of contamination, what is the level of contamination. There are certain parameters for
Where you have to notify.
You have to notify the authorities. And once you notify,
Yeah, and
Public record.
listen, and this is a radically different area, but just following the train of thought. One of my nephews who's got a job in the Pinellas Health Department. He started yesterday, and so one of the things he's doing is they have to track like hepatitis, whatever cases. So it's like if you're a doctor and somebody tests for hepatitis, you have to notify the Department of Health, and then they got to track the people. So it would hold that if you have hepatitis and the government wants to know, that if you got contaminated groundwater, the government's going to want to know too. And you're going to have to tell them.
yeah.
So, yes, Kyle.
I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I think it was maybe in the capital markets class when you talked about when you're doing environmental study, they find like an endangered animal species or something there. Do they require you to,
Yes.
basically you can't do anything? Or
Yeah,
you just
there's
have to
like
move?
in that particular site there was it was a bald eagle, which is and it's like you can't touch anything for like 3 years from the last sighting. So even if it wasn't nesting there, but it was spotted because it was an area where it sort of roamed through or might have fed from. It's like put the cross on it. Okay, I mean it's a cemetery.
Burning owls in one of her sites, and they had to like stop.
Owls. 'Cause
Yeah,
it
my
could-
mentor, Jessica Jolly, she said for one of her sites that,
Jessica's your mentor?
she said that, why is that funny? I love her. She's
God
so
bless her
sweet.
soul.
She said that one of her sites they found like burning owls, they had to like stop, like everything just needed to like stop until, because the owls are endangered. Wow.
Unrelated, in Australia, they have an overpopulation of kangaroos, and so they actually encourage people to go out and hunt and kill as many of these, even though it's a state animal. It's weird, you can eat it. The question I had was, is it different for, obviously, industrial use doesn't have the same needs for like residential or retail that has like groceries or food or something like that. Are there different thresholds with the type of uses?
Yeah, a very common one here in South Florida. For instance, arsenic is a very common, naturally found chemical in the soil in South Florida. But for different uses, there are different thresholds. So the residential threshold of the contents of arsenic are significantly higher than they would be for industrial use. So certain land may be apt for industrial use and not for residential just on that. Or may require removal of topsoil or treatment or capping or whatever other technique is used for certain uses but not for others.
Yeah, schools, for example, and I've been in that environment, they're concerned about kids playing in the dirt.
Yeah.
Contamination, no tolerance at all.
The biggest, and for instance, arsenic's always been an issue, and I don't know why. And again, what I've been told, it's a very naturally occurring chemical in ground, the ground soil here in South Florida. But what's come out over the last 3 or 4 years is that for whatever the reason, and unbeknownst to people, most City of Miami parks are on former landfills, either formal or informal. And a couple like Grapeland Park, it seemed like for whatever reason, ash, which would have a lot of arsenic, was being dumped in a lot of these places. I suspect that it had to do with fireplaces and heating, way back when. Yeah, no, if you go to houses, if you go to Little Havana and the road section of Miami, most houses have fireplaces.
For the 2 days a year you need.
For the 2 days a year. plus people came from up north to live down here and every house had a fireplace. So, you put a fireplace. But, I would expect, or maybe power plants burn coal or whatever. I don't know, but for whatever the reason. And some parts have been closed now 2 or 3 years because of the contents of arsenic in these places. Now, I played in all these parks, so maybe that's why, I look the way I do. Stephen.
So we have a project that we're doing in Kissimmee, and it's surrounded by wetlands. So we did our due diligence and we did an environmental report and it came up with nothing. It was actually part of our site plan approval, being that it was wetlands, Orange, Osceola County required it. So, like I said, it didn't have anything on the report, but we toured the property the other day, and I was with my boss actually driving. It's pretty funny. We looked over to the left, driving by the site, and literally 10 feet to the east of our property line, there's a huge bald eagle just sitting in the tree. So he looks at me, and he goes, "You never saw that."
Is there a requirement to report?
Now you're asking both legal and ethical questions. I think you know the answer to that. Somebody had their hand.
Yeah, I guess that's on YouTube, so.
Yeah, you gotta.
Your company should invest in feral cats. Just put them in.
So, just a different way of, sort of very macro. He had his list that he went through, but sort of very macro, saying, this is how I break it up in my mind, this is how we break up people in my organization, these are the general buckets that we take a look at. Not right, not wrong, it's the way he looks at it, and it definitely touches a lot of what we went through in the checklist the other day. Like I said, how many races is it?
No, it was just tax and expenses on the tax and insurance on the economical side. What other factors can impact your?
Well, look, I mean, at the end of the day, what do we say are the 3 largest operating expenses? Property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, right? Now, maybe it's utilities depending on the particular use, but the reality is I think the 2 biggest components that one brings to bear in a transaction is property taxes are going to be impacted. Why? There's a change in value, and it's being recorded. So, especially if a property has not been, sold for a lot of years, the way property appraisers work, they sort of, at one point start with a baseline and they always sort of increase it, right? When there's a big jump in value, there's going to be a big jump in property taxes, and you need to account for that, right? Now, as an owner, it may not directly impact you short term. You're in a triple net lease environment, right? And you're just going to pass all that down. In the long term, you need to have a competitive property. And if your property taxes are not in line with everybody else's, or your operating expenses in aggregate are not in line with everybody else's, it's going to affect your property one way or another, okay? The other one is insurance. Especially in Florida, insurance is an issue, okay? Insurance is an issue. So, just to say something, you're buying a building and it's being managed by CBRE and they've got it under their master insurance policy and they cover 400 million square feet throughout the country. It's sort of like underwritten across the country. The rates they're going to have on their policy are going to be significantly different than what you're going to be able to obtain as a single property owner. Or a different way, you use CBRE, it's a mom and pop owner, you're going to bring in a much bigger sort of umbrella policy, you're going to be able to bring a benefit to it. The one thing that I forgot to write down that he made a big issue of was understanding the lease structure. We're going to take a look at leases later today, but understanding the lease structure. So whether we are in a triple net environment, okay, whether we are in some sort of modified gross environment, or whether we are in a full service environment, we need to understand the lease structure that exists in any asset that we're going to acquire, or understand what the market does if we're going to develop. So when we underwrite or do our underwriting model for the development, and we say, I kept asking last week, is that gross, or is that industrial gross, or is that triple net? And there are customs that are different. Broward County is a triple net industrial market. Dade County is an industrial gross market. Now, there have been times where people in Dade County have tried to get into a triple net environment, but Dade County people quote leases in an industrial gross setting, okay? So, full service is more of an office term, industrial gross is more of an industrial term, but, what's basically the difference here? What's the difference? Somebody's about to graduate. Give me,
Pass-throughs for property taxes, insurance, and operating expenses.
come again?
The triple net is you pass through property
Right.
taxes, insurance.
So you have a stated lease rate of X, which the tenant is obliged to pay X plus all the operating expenses, right?
Yeah.
The opposite extreme of industrial gross or full service is what?
You pay.
Where you just kind of a rate.
There is a stated rate which includes
The operating expenses.
the operating expenses. So, basically the difference here is any benefit or detriment, right? Any improvement or any deterioration in the operating expense structure, the risk is borne by the tenant. Here, any deterioration, any change, or any improvement is either going to affect positively or negatively the landlord. Okay? And then you've got modified gross and, scenarios, right? So, for example, in office, this is very common where you'll be quoted a rate, say, net of electric. Right? So, you pay full service except electric is separately metered. And so the tenant will pay all the electric. Or another common one is net of electric and janitorial, right? Because in office, a lot of times the landlord will pay for the janitorial. Some large tenants will do that on their own. And so you'll pay a full service fee that excludes electric and janitorial. Those are, typical structures, especially in an office environment. Claudius.
A new one in the Brickley area, mixed environment where we have a lot of restaurants and the ground floor is water. Because restaurants use a lot of water and sewer.
There's also stops included with a lot of groceries.
Yeah, so look, this is not a class on lease structures. I hope that when you're doing the Argus class, because you've got to build the buckets, you go into detail, base years and stops. We could do that another day if you want, but the general concept of tenant at risk, landlord at risk, something in between. But you need to understand, and we'll talk later on today, what's the lease form look like and what's a standard lease form look like in a particular asset, and how close to it have the owner or previous owners followed it. Because if you come into a multi-tenant park or building or asset, and everybody's been pretty much there, and everybody's in a triple net environment, you could say, hey, property taxes are going to go up. I know what the impact is to me, 0. Now, you come into a place that's had 15 owners over the last 30 years, there's all kinds of different lease forms, there's all kinds of different deals, now you don't know what the impact is. If some guys are on net, some guys are on full service, some guys are in some sort of modified gross environment, how do you quantify the difference, okay? Or the impact of some of these, expenses. Irene?
I just wanted to share something. Going in line of the way that you structure the diligence, or how to look at the diligence, we come up with a process a long time ago, we call it a factory. Just a way to organize the diligence process. And we found that in every company, when you're doing diligence, or when you're buying a company or running a company, there's certain things in common. So we started by people, because you always have to look at the people, the management, who's the leasing agent, the broker, everything that you repeat in the other class. So we start our process with people, and everything related to people, even hiring. So that should be part of the diligence. So we started out with people. Then our next bucket was deals. In anything that you're underwriting or you're about to acquire, there's third-party vendors, there's potential deals, there's potential leasings. So anything that goes into deals regarding that particular asset, or finding a new tenant, or whatever it is. Then, like you said, marketing and market. All the comparables, the leasings, sales, so anything related with the market and the marketing. Then all the legal. All the legal is everything that you just mentioned. Then the finance side. the finance side is as paramount as understanding the rest. But also, along the way, and when I finish, it will lead you to see where the bottlenecks are while you're doing due diligence and attack them. And then capital management. For me, capital management is the structure. It's where you're gonna get the money, how you're gonna finance it, and so it's linked, but it's the capital per se, if you're having an investor, how you're gonna management, etc. So that's the capital management side. Then next is the asset management per se. So the asset management per se is how the asset has been managed, mismanaged, or where is the potential for that asset to go to. And lastly is the operations, which goes to the construction, the physical, the problems, and remediation, mitigation, etc. So if you look at all these buckets, any company works in the same way, whether you're doing due diligence or it's an ongoing operation. But if you identify all these buckets and things, at the end you can add a responsible party for each individual bucket, and you can translate it to a scorecard that is a risk management scorecard that gives you an IRR. That is not quantitative, it's qualitative. It's how you're gonna attack all those issues and if they can be mitigated or not. And at the end, maybe the numbers are telling you that you're gonna get a 33% IRR, but after you see all that in your due diligence, it tells you that there's so much red in your scorecard that you will need an 80% in order to mitigate it. Or you may be underestimating your diligence, and you could live with a 16% because everything is easier to during the due diligence process. I just want to share that.
Okay. No, listen, and I wrote my notes, like if I was in the class and I was writing my notes, right? It's about the who's gonna do it, what are they gonna do, and when are they gonna do it. You know, Irene mentioned something very interesting, which is it's important to identify where you may have a bottleneck in the process earlier rather than later. Because again, these are all time-sensitive, situations. Time is money. Time is money that you're spending during diligence. Time is a lower IRR when the clock starts ticking. Okay. The way I did my notes, from what she said, evaluation of people, primarily in a real estate realm. What I would say is you've got leasing agents, you've got property management people, you may have other operating people. Okay. Some of that translates to how are you going to manage the asset going forward. So evaluate who's doing it and what are you going to be doing going forward. You've got operating people, right? You've got operations, which also talk to the structure. What's above ground, what's below ground, right? One way to do that. Deals. So again, this is sort of pipeline. This is what's going to happen, right? We've got a sort of underwriting, right, that we got to do, right? We've got an Argus run or multiple Argus runs or spreadsheets where we understand the existing, revenue that's in place and expenses that are in place, right? But what's going to impact that? What deals are out on the street? What prospects are we talking to, right? What sales comps are there out there? What's moving the market? We talked about that. The legal, we talked about that. My friend didn't talk about the financial component because in their fund environment, the finance is handled by the CFO. So he does the property property identification and underwriting. He doesn't take a look at the structuring of the transaction, but that's critical in real estate, right? So what's capital structure going to look like? What's the cost going to look like? What does my underwriting model look like? Okay. What's my return profile? Irene's scorecard, this is probably more of a fund or a larger environment, okay, where you want to be able to show your investors, hey, we did the grid. In a more entrepreneurial setting, it's going to ultimately come down to gut feel. You're going to look at all this stuff and say, yay or nay, or I could put so much on it. But, nice tool. What's the return, risk profile look like? Yeah, my IRR is high, but, what question marks do I have along the way? Something very important to take a look at, especially if you're in an environment where you're looking at a lot of deals, right? If you're only looking at one a year, probably not that important. You're looking at 50 a year, it's important to be able to rank or identify or have some sort of frame of reference to compare to. Okay? Good, makes sense? Quincy?
It's almost, how do you get a deal through with so much stuff?
Well, but
that you can just count out? How do you get one through? It looks like you can always say, well, next.
Well,
because any of those things can be bad. You can have great everything, but the people could be horrible, and I don't want to get involved with it.
well, or you're going to have to change, or listen, Quincy. Ultimately, it's an issue of if you go. Look, I worked for a guy once who was in addition to being my boss, also ran the development business of the company, and there was not a deal that he did not like. There was no deal that he did not like. Now what do I mean? We did a bunch of bad deals. Because he was a deal junkie. He was a deal junkie. So, somebody brought him something, he wanted to do it. I mean, it was bigger than him. And so, that's the other extreme, right? That's the guy that, I see it, I gotta do it, Yes, Winston?
Well, I mean, I kind of run into something similar, in my day-to-day, right? Managing construction projects when, sometimes you'll ask somebody to do something and you can break anything down to the infinite level and it's like data overload, right? Like, it's not that hard. It's like, it's kind of, just let's assess on the surface what the variables are and figure it out. But you can always break something down to the smallest piece and become, counterproductive. Kind of miss the whole goal, right? Which is just get the problem solved. So it's, we can do it anywhere. We got to figure out where we draw that line.
Yeah, and that's, look, and at the end of the day, to the point, you're paid to get it done, so you're going to figure out how to get it done. You could be paralyzed by analysis, but you got to move forward. In the acquisition realm, you don't need to do the deal. So now and you can always find excuses not to do it, right? And there's the difference between somebody who's successful and someone who isn't, which is, what's critical. He didn't use a scorecard, and it was green or red, right? Other people are going to use gut feel, but at a certain point there's risk, right? There's risk getting out of bed in the morning. You could fall down, you can get into an accident in your car. You get a bad grade when you come to your due diligence class. I mean, there's risk in everything that you do.
By doing a scorecard, you can use what you said in the due diligence, the due diligence list. The first scorecard that I did was actually very, very simple. It was not complicated. It was just to use my gut feeling and put it somewhere. So I used the due diligence and I put it on a spreadsheet and gave a weighted average from 1 to 5 to each individual aspect of the due diligence and just created a heat map. So it wasn't time consuming, it took me 10 minutes, but I used the entire due diligence, and sometimes it applied, sometimes it didn't apply, but it didn't affect the scorecard at the end, because I could take one or not, or use it or not, because you don't go through everything on the due diligence. But it was a simple Excel tool with weighted average to give me an IRR based on those, and a heat map. Of course, along the way, it make it more complicated, but at the beginning was just a way to confirm in 10 minutes, the gut feeling. And what you said, maybe, wow, it sounds like very complicated, other things that you have to go through, but it doesn't have to.
Quincy, I showed, I think in the last capital markets class, I showed a presentation, or part of a presentation, that a guy that runs a large fund with German money. Some of the stuff they do, it's a fund called GLL. But they went through a subjective quantification process to try to identify the markets they were interested in America. And it was subjective. It's, where do I put the weight? Because, there are 50 institutional markets in America. They only buy office, but there's 50 institutional markets. But they're not going to look at 50. They're not going to have people looking at deals in 50 cities. They got to pick 10. And so they went through a process, population, you know, employment growth, you know, whatever. I don't know what it was, but they ultimately narrowed that down to this, and they would review that once a year, and they say, you know, this is going to be our focus. Somebody else can have a different perspective, but it's a tool or a way of, you know, giving you a relative, you know, weighting or valuation, or to take a look, you know, more sort of critically at what it is that you want to get to. But back to your original point, yeah, any one of these things could trip you, but the purpose of this class and the purpose of the process is not to stop, it's to mitigate loss, right? The last job, not the last, I worked for a guy in the graphic arts industries, and we had sort of a family business. We had a parting of ways, okay? You know, one of his kids couldn't take me. I couldn't particularly take the kid. And so we went through a, you know, very painful decoupling process, you know, painful emotionally, because I was part of the family in a way. So I stayed working with them until they found a new CFO, and as time went on, you know, I stayed close to them. To this day, I haven't worked with them for 20 years, but, you know, we're still friends. But a couple years after I left, the owner calls me up and he says, look, I need you to go up to Elmira, New York. There's a company we're looking at. And I said, okay. So I said, what's the problem? And he goes, well, look, you know, I really want to buy it. And I sent the CF up there, and he just told me everything, what was wrong with it, and why we couldn't buy it. So I said, okay. So I flew up there, and I kicked the tires, and I went back and said, okay, here are all the problems, here's how we fix them. And his whole point was, you know, shit, I really miss you, you know, because I have a guy that tells me what I can't do, and I had a guy that told me how to fix it. And so the diligence process is not just about, yeah, there's going to be situations, there are going to be red flags or red lines or lines in the sand where you're going to say, I can't live with that environmental issue. I can't live with that lease contingency. You know, I need to know if that guy's going to renew or not. Or you're going to say, okay, I got to set aside X amount of dollars for this. Or I have to have a patient enough capital source that knows that I may be dark on, you know, 40% of my space if this guy decides to blow out. And it takes me X amount of, you know, time to release this, for example, okay? Or I'm going to have X amount of dry powder to put CapEx into the building and that tenant goes out, or whatever. So for certain people, some of these steps may be lines in the sand. For others, it's just having the knowledge to know what you're up against and being prepared in order to tackle it. So, and there's no right or wrong answer, right? At the end of the day, everyone's got a different risk tolerance. Everyone has a different return expectation, okay? And everyone's got different tools and capabilities and structure within their organization. Some organizations may be able to deal with environmental. You know, you're a large development firm, you've got an environmental services department within, you know, your group that handles, you know, all these issues. You don't have to mess with it, you know? The other side of it is you're a one-man shop, you got the hammer, you know, here, and you're out fixing, and you don't have time to deal with that. And so you move on. And maybe for you, what for you is a stopping block isn't for somebody else. But at the end of the day, it's about knowledge. It's about gathering knowledge and knowing what you're up against. Mitigating risk. What am I up against? What am I going to face the day I own that? The day somebody gives me the keys, you know, what do I have? You know, knowledge is power. I just want to spend a couple of minutes. There's not a lot going on. I mean, there's a lot going on all the time, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time going on it. I'll have somewhere, I'll put the grades to date. It's really cumbersome. I used to send them out every week, but with 20-something students, it's very cumbersome to send them out. So I'll say nobody's struggling here. But we got to pay attention in class. We got to pay attention in class. Because at the end of the day, there's a quiz. And the quiz is all about stuff we go over in class. And we have some people that did really well. I'll tell a story about 6 years ago, something like that. I was finishing my master's at FIU, and one of the guys who was doing the master's with me came to one of my accounting classes. So he's not an accountant, he doesn't know anything about real estate, he works in a bank, but he came to one of my classes. As at the end of the class, very bright kid, he took the quiz. He got 100. Nobody else in the class got 100. But they were all real estate guys, and it was actually a nice group. And the moral of the story was, he paid attention in class. He took notes, he listened. He didn't have to. He didn't have to. He didn't even know he had a quiz. But he took notes, and he listened, and he focused, and he got 100. Okay? Just like the other day, there were people, maybe some people that have had me before that know there might be a quiz, they might know the way I think, okay? And then there were people that just turned their paper in and said, oh, I don't know the answer. So, but focus, okay? Just focus. This is all good knowledge. This is all good knowledge. This is all good knowledge. I promise it really is. Okay?
We should have our quizzes open notes.
No, you don't want
Well,
that.
You don't want
do
that.
not want
I mean, he's asking us questions about things like what's the percentage of the industrial? What's that percentage?
He wants an open book test?
No.
Hey, listen,
it will not help you.
hey, just a few things which I think are relevant, real estate or otherwise, okay? So just from a bunch of different newsletters. This was a sad one, but it's a fact. Things happen. So we've all heard that there was a LIBOR fixing case, and people were like fixing the LIBOR rate. So London jury acquits 6 former broker in a LIBOR trial. So basically, after all this stuff, they haven't been able to convict people. And I know I was a witness in an insider trading case 2 years ago now. It's January 2 years ago. Guy was guilty as, I mean, the farmer in Illinois that, somehow found out from his nephew who worked with us about the deal, and guy never bought stocks, and he bought like 60,000 out of the money call options and made $3 million overnight.
Oh, that sounds suspicious.
Yeah, but they couldn't convict him. And I'd never like been in it's like a big federal court, I'd never been in a courtroom like that. And I'm sitting there looking at the jury, and I'm saying, they don't understand anything I'm saying. It's like and I was trying to be very simple, and the case went on for the trial went on for 3 weeks. Couldn't convict the guy, and I know he was guilty. So, it's just the way things are.
Isn't there some billionaire just?
I'm sorry?
Just some billionaire just settled a.
I think as citizens, we can always argue that. So what happens is the more money you have, the better the legal or other advice that you can get. I mean, that's always been the sort of beef with the legal system in this country is the more the poorer people just don't have the resources, right? There could be an argument for that. I don't know what to tell you. I can't tell you. There's 2 kids I know that have killed people in the last 2 years drunk driving, and they're both in jail. Now, the argument is, one's in for 2 years and the other one's in for 3. But I told that one girl that's in for 3, she's like at the Dade County Stockade. I mean, she's like with bad people. So, but some people would say, hey, somebody else would have gotten 30 years or something, So I don't know. I agree with you.
It goes back to how much money do you have to pay for defense?
I have no.
The reason you did it was because
But
you
if
didn't know any
they don't
better.
have money, don't they give you a defense?
Yeah, but that's a
Are
little.
they not?
Yeah, but that goes back to the
That's
whole
what I
thing.
said. I thought they weren't that good, and then my mom was like, no, sometimes they're really good.
I was a witness in a DUI car accident, and the public defender he had 20 cases on the same day to deal with, and he has 0 time for the person. They don't have time to deal with everything, so they can't get the level of attention that you would have.
I don't. Thankfully, I don't have direct personal experience dealing with these. The public defender in Dade County is a guy that's a year older than me. He went to high school with us, and I know the guy. And I know he legitimately tries to do a good job with the resources he has, but, that's, you better get an attorney, you better find your bail bondsman and have him recommend some guy that can get you out or whatever. But listen, I know a kid, I don't know this one that well, I know a kid, he played for a friend of mine at American Heritage, he was playing at FAU, went to buy some pot in December, some guys rushed in, so he went to Miami Gardens to buy some pot. They didn't have any. So the guy said, hey, we want some too. Why don't you go to the other guy you buy? So they followed him. So he goes to one of the apartments next to FAU. You know, they let him in because he bought pot there before. The other guys rush in, kill the guy.
Oh, I read about that.
You read about that? He's a nice guy. You see how scared he is in jail? He got a public defender. He's still in jail. It's been a month and a half. He didn't pull the trigger. Nobody else has been caught.
That's for smoking weed?
I
Well, it's a
know.
murder, I mean.
Well, that's but the point at the end where I'm going is you don't want to be there, you know, like,
Yeah.
you know, so now they've got an attorney and, but anyway, listen, the way other things aren't fair at times too, right? So this
Well, I
one,
mean, it was bicycle.
I like, whether things are fair or not fair, I don't know, but just awareness, general awareness. I don't know if you guys saw that this guy, Rouhani, the president of Iran, was making the rounds through Europe this week. He went to meet the Pope, and then, but more importantly, and they covered up the naked statues at the Vatican, and then he went to France, and they actually didn't have a state dinner because, you know, in France you have to have wine, and he couldn't have wine. So, whatever. But anyway, the issue is so, you know, we go through all this, we've gone through in this country, a 30-some-odd, you know, year cycle of like a Cold War with Iran and, you know, kind of a, you know, very sort of indirect war with them. And the guy goes and buys $23 billion worth of airplanes from Airbus, from the French, you know, and they entertain the guy and all that. So, you know, well, damn, why didn't they buy Boeing planes, you know? But, you know, it's kind of funny how some people in the world will, you know, sell their soul, and, you know, his next stop is going to be Germany, you know, and all the German industrial firms will go over there and build all the nuclear reactors so that they can, you know, create a bomb and all that. But that's just the way the world works. Now, more directly involved with finance and the cost of capital, and maybe why the Treasury is at 2%, the 10-year. Fears grow that an enormous corporate debt might herald recession. That's a big concern, right? So, but listen to this. This is kind of frightening. This is from Bloomberg. It says credit markets are in a bad shape. It says rating downgrades have surged. It said a third of companies worldwide are earning too little to service debt. Okay, and that